In the flat, wind-scoured spring of 2003, 26-year-old Jocelyn Dufresne stood at the edge of her dead father's canola fields and watched 400 Rouen ducks waddle off the back of a rented livestock trailer and scatter into the stubble like a feathered invasion. They were loud, confused, and magnificent, their iridescent heads catching the pale Saskatchewan sun as they fanned out across the bare earth, jabbing their bills into the cracked soil with the blind enthusiasm of creatures that had no idea they were part of an experiment that every sane farmer in the municipality had already declared insane. She had inherited the farm 6 months earlier, 640 acres of flat prairie outside the town of Rosthern, north of Saskatoon, where the sky was so enormous it made you feel like a punctuation mark on an empty page. Her father, Aurel Dufresne, had worked this land for 31 years, and in the end the land had worked him right back. Pancreatic cancer took him in October, quick and merciless, and he left behind a paid-off quarter section, a half section mortgaged to the teeth, a shop full of aging machinery, and a collection of spiral-bound notebooks that filled an entire shelf above his desk in the cramped off at the kitchen. Those notebooks were his real inheritance to her. Aurel had not been a man of many words. He was the kind of prairie father who showed love through action. Through the quiet act of driving her to school in a blizzard without complaint, through the way he let her ride on the combine's buddy seat every harvest from the time she was 4, through the fact that he never once told her a farm was no place for a girl, even when every other man in the district seemed to think exactly that. What he did instead was write things down, not poetry, not journals in the sentimental sense, but observations, thousands of them. Temperature, rainfall, soil moisture, pest counts, yield data, all recorded in his careful, slanted handwriting alongside small sketches and margin notes that read more like the musings of a naturalist than a grain farmer. It was in those notebooks that Jocelyn found the seed of everything that followed. Her father had been obsessed with the sloughs. Every prairie farm had them. Those low-lying depressions that filled with snowmelt and rain each spring, forming temporary wetlands that most farmers considered a nuisance, wasted acreage, breeding grounds for mosquitoes. The government had been paying farmers to drain them for decades, and most had obliged. Aurel had not. He kept his 4 sloughs intact, and in his notebooks, he had recorded something that no one else seemed to notice. The canola planted in the rows immediately adjacent to the sloughs consistently out-yielded the rest of the field by 15 to 20%. The plants were taller, greener, more vigorous, and they had fewer flea beetles. Flea beetles were the plague of every canola grower on the prairies. Tiny, black, voracious, they descended on the young seedlings in spring and could strip a field to bare stems in a matter of days. The solution, as dictated by every agronomist and every chemical company, and every pamphlet from the provincial agriculture department, was neonicotinoid seed treatment. You coated your canola seed in a film of insecticide before planting, and it killed the beetles when they fed on the emerging plants. It was effective. It was also, as the years went on, becoming less effective. The beetles were developing resistance. Farmers were doubling their rates, switching products, spraying foliar insecticides on top of the seed treatment, spending more money each year to achieve the same diminishing result. Aurel had written about this in a notebook dated 1998, 5 years before his death. The words were underlined twice, which for him was the equivalent of shouting, "The ducks in the East Slough eat the beetles. I have watched them. They wade into the canola edge and pick them off the stems like candy. The rows near the slough have almost no damage. Why does no one talk about this?" Below it, he had drawn a simple diagram. A field, a slough in the middle, ducks swimming in the slough, arrows radiating outward showing the ducks moving into the surrounding crop. Beside the arrows, he had written, "What if the slough was everywhere?" He never pursued it. By 1998, he was already feeling the first symptoms he would ignore for 4 more years, and the debt on the half section was growing. And the price of canola was dropping, and there was never enough time or money or energy to chase a wild idea when the conventional path, however expensive, at least had the comfort of being understood. Jocelyn read that notebook entry on a gray November evening, 3 weeks after the funeral, sitting in her father's office chair with a cup of tea going cold beside her. The furnace ticked in the basement. The house was silent in the way that only a house recently emptied of its last occupant can be. She read his words, looked at his drawing, and felt something shift inside her chest, a gear engaging that had been waiting for exactly this moment. She spent the winter researching. She drove to the university library in Saskatoon and read everything she could find about integrated pest management, about duck foraging behavior, about the ecological role of prairie wetlands. She found scattered references to rice duck farming in Japan and China, systems where farmers released ducks into flooded rice paddies to eat insects and weeds. The ducks fertilized the water with their droppings, aerated the soil with their feet, and produced eggs and meat as a secondary crop. It was ancient, elegant, and it worked. But no one had ever tried it with canola on the Canadian prairies. The conditions were different. The crop was different. The pests were different. There was no manual, no precedent, no guarantee. She did the math anyway. The neonicotinoid seed treatment for 640 acres cost her $11,000. The foliar spray backup cost another $8,000. The ducks, 400 Rouen yearlings from a breeder near Humboldt, cost $6 each, $2,400. She would need portable fencing to guide them, a few simple shelters, supplemental feed. Call it $5,000 total. Less than a third of the chemical program, and unlike the chemicals, the ducks would breed. In March, she canceled her seed treatment order. The call from the seed dealer, a man named Mr. Faulkner, who also happened to farm the section directly north of hers, came within the hour. He was polite, concerned, and utterly certain she was making a mistake. "Jocelyn, I saw you pulled the treatment order. Just wanted to make sure that wasn't an error in the system." "It wasn't an error, Mr. Faulkner." A pause. She could hear him breathing, recalibrating. "You know the beetle pressure last year was the worst in a decade. Without treatment, you're looking at significant stand loss. Could lose 30–40% of your crop before it even gets going. I'm aware of that." "So what's your plan?" she told him. She told him about the ducks, the sloughs, her father's observations, the Asian rice duck systems. She laid it all out clearly and calmly, the way she had rehearsed it in her head a dozen times. The silence on the other end lasted so long she thought the call had dropped. "Ducks," he finally said, and the single word contained an entire essay of disbelief. "Ruined ducks. 400 of them." "Jocelyn," his voice shifted to the tone men on the prairies used when they were about to say something they considered wise. "Your father was a good man, a careful farmer. But this, I have to be straight with you. This is not something he would have done." "Actually, Mr. Faulkner, it's exactly what he would have done. He just ran out of time." He tried once more, gently, suggesting she at least treat half the seed as insurance, but she thanked him and hung up. By the end of the week, the story had made its way through every coffee shop and co-op office in the region. Orel's girl was putting ducks in the canola. The grief had gotten to her. Such a shame. Now let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever stood in a place where you knew with absolute certainty that you were right, and yet every voice around you, every person you respected, every authority you had been taught to trust told you that you were wrong? It is a specific kind of loneliness. It is not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of conviction. The terrible clarity of seeing something that others cannot or will not see. That was where Jolyn Dufresne stood in the spring of 2003 on 640 acres of prairie soil with 400 ducks and the handwritten notes of a dead man as her only allies. The first official challenge arrived in May, 2 weeks after seeding. The canola was just emerging, pale green cotyledons pushing through the dark earth, and the flea beetles had arrived with them, a shimmering black tide. On every neighboring farm, the treated seeds were doing their work, the seedlings protected by the chemical armor they carried in their cells. On Joseline's fields, the beetles were landing unchecked, but the ducks were moving. She had set up the system carefully, dividing the fields into sections with portable electric netting and rotating the flock through each section on a 3-cycle. The ducks, it turned out, were extraordinary foragers. They worked the rows methodically, their flat bills probing the base of each plant, picking off beetles with a speed and precision that no spray nozzle could match. They ate the beetles, they ate the beetle larvae in the soil, and they ate the weed seeds. Their droppings, rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, dissolved into the earth with the next rain. Mr. Breton, the district agronomist from the Provincial Agriculture Office, showed up unannounced on a Tuesday morning. He was a tall, angular man with a clipboard, and the particular brand of confidence that comes from having a master's degree and never having planted a seed in his life. He had been sent, he said, after receiving concerns from neighboring producers about the potential for pest migration from an untreated field. He walked the rows with Joseline, frowning at the ducks as they bustled around his boots. "Miss Dufresne," he said, flipping through a printed fact sheet, "flea beetle management in canola is a well-established protocol. Neonicotinoid seed treatments provide consistent protection at the critical cotyledon stage. What you're attempting here is, to be frank, outside any recommendation we would make." "The rows the ducks have already worked are clean," Joseline said, pointing. "Less than 10% feeding damage. Your threshold for economic injury is 25%. He looked. The plants in the section the ducks had grazed 2 days prior were indeed standing healthy and green, with only minor leaf notching. The section ahead of the flock, not yet worked, showed heavier damage. The contrast was visible from where they stood. Mr. Breton made a note on his clipboard. "An interesting anecdotal observation," he said carefully. "But anecdotes are not data. You have no control plots, no replication, no statistical framework. I can't endorse this as a viable pest management strategy based on one visual observation." "My father collected data for 5 years," she said. "Yield comparisons between rows near the sloughs and rows further away. 15 to 20% higher yields near the sloughs every single year. I have the notebooks." Notebooks. He said the word the way you might say folk remedy. He looked past her toward the flock. One of the ducks had climbed onto a fence post and was regarding him with an expression of serene superiority. "Miss Dufresne, my responsibility is to the agricultural community in this district. If your untreated fields become a breeding reservoir for flea beetles that then migrate to your neighbor's treated fields, you will be creating a problem that extends well beyond your own fence line." "Beetles fly," Joseline said evenly. "They've been migrating between fields since before either of us was born, treated or not." He left with a polite but firm warning that he would be monitoring the situation. He later mentioned her farm in a regional newsletter as an example of non-standard practices that carry elevated agronomic risk and recommended that surrounding producers maintain vigilant scouting. The second summer was harder than the first. The ducks were thriving, breeding in the restored sloughs that Jocelyn had deepened and connected with Chalachu channels, turning her farm into a network of small wetlands linked by the field rows between them. But the canola market dipped, and her yield, while decent, was not spectacular. She made enough to cover the mortgage and the feed bill, with almost nothing left over. The ducks needed supplemental grain through the winter, and the portable fencing needed constant repair. She spent her evenings mending netting by the light of the shop's single bulb, her hands raw from the wire, her back aching from a day of moving shelters. It was during this second winter that Mr. Grayson appeared. He represented one of the multinational agrochemical companies. A man in his 50s with an easy smile, a firm handshake, and a car that probably cost more than everything in Jocelyn's shop combined. He had heard about her operation, he said. Word travels in agricultural circles. He wasn't here to sell her anything, he assured her. He was here to listen. He sat at her kitchen table, accepted a cup of coffee, and asked thoughtful questions. How had her father come to his observations? What was her rotation schedule for the ducks? How did she manage the flock in winter? He was good. He was very good. He made her feel heard. Then, gradually, the conversation shifted. Jocelyn, I have enormous respect for what you're doing here. Truly. But I want to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty. The canola market is tightening. Input costs are going up. Your neighbors, the ones using our products, they're locking in crop insurance rates based on their treated yields. Your untreated acres are being assessed at a lower coverage level because you have no established yield history without inputs. If you have one bad year, one drought, one early frost, you won't have the safety net they have. He reached into his briefcase and produced a glossy folder. We have a new program, integrated stewardship, we call it. Reduced rate seed treatments, targeted foliar applications only when beetle counts exceed threshold. It's a step toward what you're already doing, but with a chemical foundation. We would sponsor your farm as a demonstration site. Full product provided at no cost for 3 years. In exchange, we collect data. You get the protection, we get the story. Everyone wins. He was offering her safety. He was offering her legitimacy. All she had to do was put the chemicals back in. Jocelyn looked at the folder, then at the window where the late afternoon light was turning the snow on her fields a pale gold. Mr. Grayson, my father spent his whole life watching this land. He saw something that your company's products were designed to make invisible. The beetles aren't the problem. They're a symptom. The problem is that we turned the prairie into a factory floor and killed everything that used to keep it in balance. Your program doesn't fix that. It just makes the factory quieter. His smile remained, but his eyes changed. That's a philosophical position, not a business plan. My father thought they were the same thing. He left the folder on the table. She put it in the recycling bin that evening. Nakublin, let me tell you about Aurel, because to understand what happened on that farm, you have to understand the man who planted the idea that grew into it. He was born in 1946, the son of a Quebecois family that had moved west during the Depression, chasing the promise of cheap land. He grew up speaking French at home and English everywhere else, and he carried both languages inside him like two rivers flowing in the same channel. He was not educated in the formal sense. He finished grade 10, and then his father needed him on the farm. And that was that. But Aurel watched. Lord, how that man watched. He would stand at the edge of a slough for an hour, not hunting, not fishing, just watching. He saw the red-winged blackbirds arrive each spring and noted the date. He saw the painted turtles sun themselves on logs and counted them. He saw the way the ducks, the wild mallards and pintails that nested in the tall grass around the sloughs, would venture out into the crop rows each morning, and he saw what they left behind. Not just droppings, but order, fewer weeds, fewer insects, healthier plants. He began recording these observations in 1992, the year Jocelyn turned 15. She would sometimes walk with him on those evening circuits of the farm, and he would point things out. "Look at that, Josie," he would say, using the name only he used for her. "See how the canola is taller here, right up against the water? 3 inches taller than the middle of the field. Same seed, same planting date, same rain. So what's different?" "The ducks," she had guessed, half joking. He had looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not surprise, but recognition, as if she had spoken a password. "The ducks," he had repeated, quietly. "Everything that lives it comes out of it. The water carries life into the field, and the field carries life back into the water. It's a circle, Josie. But we broke the circle. We drained the sloughs and poisoned the water and killed the ducks, and then we wondered why the soil was dead." He never assembled it into a plan. He was too tired, too ground down by the economics of a system that punished every deviation from the norm. He did what every struggling prairie farmer did. He bought the treated seed. He sprayed when he had to. He went into debt a little more each year. And he wrote his observations in his notebooks like letters to a future he sensed he would not live to see. Now let me explain the science, because the science is beautiful. A healthy prairie ecosystem is a web of relationships so intricate that no single thread can be pulled without affecting all the others. The sloughs, those temporary wetlands that prairie farmers had been draining for a century, were the linchpins of that web. They filtered runoff, recharged groundwater, moderated temperature extremes, and provided habitat for hundreds of species of birds, insects, amphibians, and microorganisms. The ducks that nested around them were not just residents, they were workers. Their foraging controlled insect populations. Their droppings fertilized the water and the surrounding soil. Their movement between water and land transported nutrients, seeds, and beneficial microorganisms in both directions. When you drained a slough, you didn't just lose a pond. You lost a biological engine. You lost the pest control, the fertilization, the water regulation, the microbial exchange. You lost the circle that Aurel had seen. What Jocelyn did was rebuild the circle deliberately and at scale. The 400 ruined ducks were not a quirky alternative to pesticide. They were the reintroduction of a missing ecological function. The ducks ate the flea beetles, yes, but they also ate weed seeds, reducing her herbicide needs. Their droppings added nitrogen and phosphorus to the soil, reducing her fertilizer costs. Their constant movement through the rows broke up the soil surface crust, improving water infiltration. And the restored sloughs, now connected by shallow channels and populated by a self-sustaining breeding flock, created a network of biological oases that radiated health outward into the surrounding crop. The effect was cumulative. In the first year, it was barely measurable. In the second, it was visible to Jocelyn, but no one else. In the third year, it became undeniable. Her canola emerged that spring into the worst flea beetle outbreak in 15 years. Provincial entomologists issued emergency advisories. Farmers who had relied on seed treatments watched in horror as the beetles, now significantly resistant, chewed through their chemical defenses. Emergency foliar sprays were applied at enormous cost, and still the damage was severe. Across the district, yields fell by 20 to 30%. On Jocelyn's farm, the ducks went to work. The flock, now over 700 strong after 2 years of breeding, moved through the fields in a coordinated wave. They had learned the rotation by now, waiting at the netting each morning for Jocelyn to open the next section. She would later describe them as the most disciplined workforce she had ever seen. They cleared each section with remarkable thoroughness, and the canola behind them stood green and healthy, barely touched. That fall, the yield numbers were posted at the elevator in Rostern. Jocelyn Dufresne, 42 bushels per acre. District average, 28 bushels per acre. Her input cost per acre. District average input cost, 68. The numbers were so far outside the norm that the elevator manager called her to verify there hadn't been a weighing error. There had not. She also sold 300 ducks that year to a specialty poultry buyer in Saskatoon. That was another $4,200. And 40 dozen eggs to a farm gate market in Rostern, another $1,800. Income streams that hadn't existed before and cost her almost nothing to produce. The silence at the co-op that winter was a specific kind of silence. It was the sound of men rearranging their understanding of the world. It was in the 5th year, the year the drought came, that the full measure of what Jocelyn had built became apparent. The rain stopped in June and didn't return until September. The prairie baked under a relentless sun. Creek beds cracked. Dugouts shrank to mud. Farmers watched their canola wilt and curl, the chemically dependent soil unable to hold the little moisture it received. Emergency haying permits were issued. The word disaster began appearing in headlines. But Jocelyn's sloughs, deepened and connected, held water longer than anyone expected. The restored wetlands acted as reservoirs, slowly releasing moisture into the surrounding soil through the network of shallow channels. The duck-enriched soil, now thick with organic matter after 4 years of biological management, held that moisture like a sponge. Her canola was stressed but alive. Her yields dropped, but only to 31 bushels, still above the pre-drought district average. Most of her neighbors were below 20. Some didn't bother combining at all. Mr. Faulkner, the seed dealer and neighbor who had made that first phone call 5 years earlier, came to see her in October. He didn't call ahead. He simply appeared at the end of her lane, his truck idling, his window down. She walked out to meet him. He looked old. The drought had aged him. His own crop had been devastated. And the debt he had taken on for inputs he could no longer justify was pulling him under. I owe you an apology, he said, without preamble, his eyes fixed on the steering wheel. I told people you were foolish. I said it to your face, near enough, and I was wrong. Jocelyn leaned on the truck's door. You weren't wrong to worry, Mr. Faulkner. You were looking out for me. I was looking down on you. There's a difference. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 farmers on the edge of a stubble field, the autumn wind pulling at their jackets. Your father saw it, he said quietly, and I was too busy looking at my own feet to see what he was pointing at. Mr. Breton, the district agronomist, never apologized. But 2 years after the drought, the Provincial Agriculture Department quietly published a research brief on the potential role of managed waterfowl in integrated pest management for canola systems. The brief cited Jocelyn's farm data, which she had been meticulously recording in her own notebooks, continuing her father's tradition. It acknowledged promising preliminary results and recommended further study. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a standing ovation. Mr. Grayson returned one more time in the 7th year. His company had launched a new division, Biological Solutions, they called it, and he wanted to discuss a partnership. They would fund research on her system, brand it, develop a commercial duck management package complete with certified flocks, proprietary feed blends, and GPS-tracked portable fencing systems. They would pay her a licensing fee and a consultancy retainer. The numbers were significant, more money than the farm had ever generated. Jocelyn listened. She poured him coffee. She asked good questions, and then she said no. Why not? He asked, genuinely baffled. This could scale. This could change prairie agriculture. It could, she said, but not the way you're imagining it. You want to turn it into a product, a kit, a thing someone buys and applies. But that's exactly the thinking that got us here in the first place. The ducks aren't a product, Mr. Grayson. They're a relationship. Every farm is different. Every piece of land has its own slows, its own soil, its own history. The farmer has to learn their own land. They have to watch it, the way my father watched his. You can't put that in a box. With respect, Jocelyn, you can't scale a philosophy. You don't need to scale it. You just need to teach people to pay attention. That scales itself. He left without the deal. She never saw him again. The years that followed were a quiet expansion, not of ambition, but of influence. Jocelyn began hosting visits from other farmers, one or two at a time, walking them around the sloughs, showing them the duck rotation, letting them hold the dark, crumb-rich soil in their hands. She didn't lecture, she showed, and she always started in the same place, the office off the kitchen, where her father's notebooks sat on the shelf beside her own growing collection. "Read this," she would say, handing them the 1998 notebook, open to the page with the diagram. "Then come walk with me." In the farm crisis of 2008, when canola prices crashed and input costs soared, and 3 farms in her district went into receivership, Jocelyn bought Mr. Faulkner's North Quarter. He came to her because the bank was going to take it, and he would rather she had it than them. She paid him what she could, which was less than it was worth and more than the bank would have given him. She restored his drained sloughs, extended the duck network, and within 3 years the soil that had been gray and compacted under his chemical regime was darkening, softening, coming alive. She eventually managed over 2,000 acres, not through aggressive acquisition, but through the quiet gravitational pull of results that could not be argued with. She became known across the prairies as the Duck Lady of Rosthern, a title she accepted with the same calm amusement she had shown to every skeptic who had crossed her lane. If you were to drive out to that farm today, you would find a woman in her late 40s, her hair pulled back under a faded cap, her boots caked with the black soil that is her proudest achievement. You would find sloughs teeming with ducks, frogs, dragonflies. You would find canola fields so green and vigorous they look almost unreal against the surrounding landscape. And you would find, in the office off the kitchen, 2 shelves now, one for his notebooks and one for hers, side by side. A conversation between father and daughter that spans decades, written in the same careful handwriting, filled with the same patient observations of a piece of land that was never broken, only misunderstood. She has a niece now, a young woman named Therese, who studies ecology at the University of Saskatchewan and spends her summers on the farm. Jocelyn teaches her the way Aurel taught her, not with lectures or textbooks, but with walks. Long, slow walks along the slough edges at dusk, when the ducks are settling and the blackbirds are calling, and the prairie sky is doing that thing it does, turning every color the earth has ever known. "Listen," Jocelyn tells her, stopping at the water's edge, the way her father used to stop. "What do you hear?" The girl listens. She hears the water, she hears the ducks, she hears the wind moving through canola that was grown without a single drop of poison. "I hear the farm," Therese says. Jocelyn smiles. It is the smile of a woman who made a promise to a dead man and kept it, not with anger or defiance, but with 400 ducks and the unshakable belief that if you stop fighting the land and start feeding it, the land will remember what it was always meant to be. The story of Jocelyn Dufresne is, in the end, the oldest story on the prairies. The experts looked at a farm and saw a production problem. They prescribed chemicals the way a doctor prescribes painkillers, masking the symptom, ignoring the cause, and sending the bill to the next generation. Jocelyn, guided by the quiet hand of her father's notebooks, looked at the same farm and saw a living system that had been silenced. She did not invent a solution. She restored a relationship. The ducks were just the beginning. The rest was patience, observation, and the stubborn, luminous faith that the land knows how to heal itself if you simply give it back what was taken away.